start off by acknowledging that Georgian College and its campuses are situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people. And while the Anishinaabe include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy, Georgian College is dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And while I am currently sitting in Georgian College in my office on this campus, at the Barrie campus, I acknowledge also that there are many of us who are sitting not on campus and not necessarily on the lands of the Anishinaabe people. And I encourage you all to also to do some research, and if you don't already know, to learn which lands that you are situated on. Again, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Isabelle Deschamps today. Isabelle has been a faculty member at Georgian College since June of 2017. She received her PhD from McGill University. Yay, McGill, I went to McGill too. In 2013 from the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders, and holds a graduate diploma specialized in mental health. She also completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Speech and Hearing Neuroscience Laboratory at Cerveau Brain Research Center in Quebec City, where her research program focused on the cognitive neuroscience of language. Currently, Isabelle is leading research funded by the Future Skills Center related to digital innovation in teaching at Georgian College. But today, Isabelle will be talking about some of her research that was funded through the Research, Innovation, and Scholarship Grant Program offered through the Department of Research and Innovation. Her talk today is called Stress, Coping Strategies, Anxiety, and Depression Among First-Year College Students, Gaining Insights into Georgian College's Student Population, which is a topic I think that resonates with more than just first-year college students. And I'm sure we're all intrigued to hear what her research is finding. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Isabelle. And also because my parents are calling, I'm going to take that call later. Over to you, Isabelle.
Thank you very much, Mira. So this is actually my first research project that I did at Georgian College, and I started just before the pandemic. We went online with the pandemic, so we didn't get a full data set because once we went online, I couldn't collect data for obvious reason, but we still, with the help of the big data analytics program at Georgian College, looked at this study. Results that we had kind of indicated towards with regards to how stressed our students are, what kind of strategies they're using, and really what we were interested in is seeing what's happening here at Georgian so we can actually better support our students. So what we know from research, so this is not necessarily a novel topic, because we do know that college is a learning journey, and students, depending on their background, where they're coming from, they have to adapt to this new educational and social environment. One thing that I did notice, I teach out of the Aurelia campus, and I teach usually first-year students, is we had a lot of students, international students, and some of them seem to be really struggling adapting to a small campus, and Aurelia is very isolated compared to Barrie, where others seem to just flourish. So I was kind of curious as to why there were students that seemed to struggle a bit more and others that didn't. And when we look at students, sometimes we tend to forget as faculty that in addition to their school life, if you want, they also have their personal life. So stressors are not only coming from attending a new college or starting a new career, it's also coming from home. So what I wanted to do was actually draw or get a data set that would kind of tell us what kind of stressors are students facing, and are there differences between international and domestic student. So these were actually some of the bigger questions that we wanted to look at. And we know that coping strategies play a huge role in how you can actually deal with stressors in daily life. So if you have healthy coping mechanism, then you tend to do better at school. and be a better achiever. Whereas if you have negative coping skills, then usually it has an impact, detrimental impact on how well you do in school. So we do know that how you react to stress, how you cope with stress has an impact on how well you learn. Also, we know that our student population across Canada and even in the United States, depression and anxiety rates are going up. And this is also correlated with academic success. So students that score higher on depression and anxiety scales tend to do less well in school in their respective program. So what my goal was with this research project was to actually draw a portrait of the students, the first year students that we have at Georgian College, so I could share with the placement office, with the first year student office, as well as with counseling services, some of the things that we discovered with this project to better support students. So the other facet of this project is that we do know that domestic and international students, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in the United States or in Europe, have common stressors, but we also know that there are some differences in the stressors. So when you're learning a second language, English as a second language, and you're going to a campus in Canada where English is the main language, that could cause additional stress if you're not as proficient in that language. And we also know that from culture to culture, there are some differences among the coping strategies that are used and how we react to stress. If you think about some cultures, how we react to stress is more moderated than in some cases here. So taking into consideration all of these factors, what we did is we wanted to identify the main source of stress that are affecting the international students at Georgian College and the domestic students. We wanted to see exactly the coping strategies that students were using, because coping strategies are teachable skills. This is something that we can address. The same way as if we understand the main source of stress, we can also target these specific sources to help relieve some of the stress that's related to that. So the goal was to actually see as well how students react to stress. And the way we did it was to use Georgian College student as a student pool. So we basically recruited online all first year students enrolled at Georgian College. The only criteria was they had to be 18 years of age or older, and this is for ethics purposes. And they had to be first year student. It didn't matter if they were returning, like someone that came back to college for a second degree or diploma, and they were, as long as it was the full-time first year students. So we had some that were just out of high school, but we also had students that were returning for a change of career. And these are all demographics that we actually capture with the study. So I'm a big fan of numbers. So when I do many of my studies, I look for metrics that have been used and that are robust, meaning that they've been used by more than one study, and there's validity to the scales that they've used. So for this study, we used what is called a scope, and it's actually quite an interesting measurement, because what it does is it measures differences in coping strategy. And the reason why it's the revised COPE is that the original COPE had more items, but with time, what they found was that some of these items were really measuring the same thing. So they reshaped it and kind of minimize the amount of questions. So there's less, which is good in this sense because it takes less time to complete and it has the same validity. So they were able to capture the 5 forms of coping responses to stress, which are self-help, approach, accommodation, avoidance, and self-punishment. And these are some of the examples of the questions that you would have for self-help. And this work was done by Zuckerman and Gagne out of Concordia University. So what students were asked to do with regards to this project is it was an online survey, so completely anonymous. We used a survey tool that allowed us to collect consent, but also to have all of our questionnaires within one survey. Students were free to stop at any time. So if they stop halfway, then the data was not included in the database. They had to actually complete the entire survey and consent that once they submit the survey, the data was going to be used. And there was a lot of data collected. This is another example of the RCOPE, which is the approach, way of coping, accommodation, avoidance, and self-punishment. So you can see here that depending on which strategies or coping mechanism are used, there's some that are healthier. Self-punishment is not considered a healthy way of coping with stress. So what we wanted to see with regards to this one metric is, do we find differences between international and domestic students? The other metric that we use is called the University Stress Scale. And this is basically a scale that measures the main source of stress for students. If you just look on Google, there's like a million different scales that measure the stressors in people's life. Here, we decided to use this one because it has been used by many studies with college and university students, which was our concern, because as you can imagine, some of the stress scales that are out there don't really capture the reality of being a student. So we really wanted to make sure that the stressors identified were actually part of what students were facing. And this is actually an example of the scale where they have to rate on a Likert scale how much they experience each of these stressors. And here, the key is that we didn't want to have, as much as we would like to have huge scales and a lot of data, we also have to be mindful of time. And because we were actually capturing many different factors, one of the concerns with ethics was it was taking too much time. So we had to make sure that we took metrics that were short enough that was not a burden on the participants. The last metric that we have is called the ESRQ, and it's a 14-item questionnaire on a Likert scale that measures how we react to stress. And the beauty of this metric is it takes less than 2 minutes to complete. And it's actually something that's used in the field with veterans or military personnel or paramedics. So following a traumatic event, they can actually complete this scale because it's fast enough to capture how they were feeling at the moment that they experienced the stress or the trauma. And here what we asked students was to reflect on the last time something caused them stress and to say to us, well, okay, how did you feel in that moment? And as you can see, the intensity augments as you go from, being indifferent to the event to actually being mad, angry, or having many negative feelings towards the event itself. So this is another metric to capture how we react to stress. And this one is not perfect by any means because we ask them to reflect on the last event that caused them stress. But it's a quick tool to look at the emotions that are felt by students when they experience stress. And I'm sure that some of you can relate in the classroom. For example, I've seen students come to me and they say, well, this is happening at home, and they actually they see it as a challenge. Like they're energized, they want to tackle that problem, and they devote their energy to problem solving and using positive coping strategies, where there's others that come and they have a similar problem, but they're completely at loss. They don't know where to begin. They're mad that it's happening. So in the classroom, this is something I saw, is that students were reacting differently. And I wanted to see exactly if we could predict, based on the data that we collected, if it was more likely for international students, depending on your culture, or maybe domestic students. So this, if you look at this beautiful quilt, it represents the stressors that are experienced by the students. So if on my left hand side, we have the domestic students, and on the right hand side, we have the international students. And what we do see is that the way it works is that the color codes are the same in both diagram. So if you look, for example, at mental health, which would be down here for domestic students, 80% of the students responded that this was one of the stressors, mental health issues were one of the stressor experience, where only 65% of the international students responded that this was one of the stressor they experience. What was interesting is that the study life balance was identified 100% of the time by domestic student as being the main source of stress. So finding a healthy balance between work, life, and school. Where for our international students, and many of them are actually working as well, 85% of them actually identified them. For them, the biggest problem was actually finances and money. So there are common stressors, as we can see by comparing the colors in the two diagrams. But one of the things that we do notice is that they're not to the same extent. Transport for a domestic student is actually a huge cause of stress. And I was wondering why at first, and then talking to students in Aurelia, many of them coming from a different country, for example, thought they were going to the Barrie campus. So they actually rented an apartment in Barrie to learn that ECE, early childhood education, is actually in Aurelia or Owen Sound. So then they had to find commute, and before the link bus, it was not that great to commute between Barrie and Aurelia. Also, language and cultural issues are a huge source of stress for international students, where for our domestic student, finances and money problems are also a problem. So what was interesting is that while there is common stressors, the degree to which international and domestic students are affected by these stressors is different. And one of the things that surprised me was that the study life balance, I thought that this would be less for a domestic student or similar to the international students, but to have 100% of the respondents say that this is a cause of a stressor, then clearly there's something about the skills, self-regulation skills or time management that maybe is lacking or that students don't have, where they feel overwhelmed with having to juggle both college and their home life. The university and college environment was also a source of stress, but this one equally for both domestic and international students. For domestic students, parenting issues were one of the stressors, like at 34%. So it's not huge, but it was still a bigger stressor than for our international students. And procrastination. And this one was higher in international students than it was in domestic students. And this one also was a little bit surprising, because from what I observe in the classroom, what I see in the classroom is usually the opposite, but it might be biased by the programs that I teach in and also the students that I have. Housing was a big concern as well for international students. Less so for domestic students. And if we think about housing, especially in smaller campuses, in Aurelia, it's hard to find a place. And I think it's the same in Barrie as well. But for international students that are coming to Canada for the first time, it might be extremely challenging to find a suitable place to live. So this is just a little summary of the top 5 stressors per group for each of for domestic student and international students. So when we look at how they react to stress, they also react differently. Our international students seem to react in a way where they are energized by the stress. And if we look at the orange box, which is represented for the energetic component, our domestic students, 60% are actually energized by stress. They react more negatively. They are concerned, although they are concentrated, similar to the international student. Angry was also low in both cases, which was interesting. Alert was also high in both. So there are positive reactions by both our international and domestic students to stress, but there's still some differences. Now, the one part of the study that was a little bit more disappointing from a research perspective is when we looked at the coping skills, we actually did not find a difference between our international and our domestic student. And while I was disappointed because I really thought that there would actually be a difference, one of the things that I had to remind myself is that we were planning to recruit over 300 students, which we didn't get because COVID hit. And as soon as we went online, I had to actually pull the survey down because COVID just added another layer of stress onto college life, and I had no way of measuring it. So then I would not be able to actually pool all my participants together. I would have to account for the stress caused by COVID for the participants that were tested after March versus the one that were tested prior to March. So we just closed the survey. So I did not have as many students as I wanted to, and my groups were not equal either, because it's much easier to recruit domestic students than it is to recruit international students. So just bear in mind that while we did not find differences, it doesn't mean that there are none. The optimal would be to redo the study again and then to recruit the full 300 or 400 students that I need to have enough statistical power to detect differences between the two groups. So when we looked at the data in itself, what we can say is that, yes, we do have common stressors for both our international and domestic students, but they actually contribute differently because they're not experienced to the same extent. And it's not until we start taking into consideration the different types of stressors that we can actually better support students. Procrastination is not dealt with in the same way as someone that's worrying over their finances and is worried about losing their apartment because they didn't have enough money for the next month. So when we look at our students, we have to also look at the different stresses that they're exposed to. The same way that if you're living at home with your parents, finances might not be a huge cause of stress, but there might be others if English is not your first language and you struggle with English. So knowing that finances and transport are the top stressors for our international student, then it clearly points in the direction of, okay, well, we need to actually target these stressors, and transportation is something that the college can help with, right? And same thing with finances. Maybe it's about managing your finances, or maybe understanding how it works here in Canada with regards to rent, right? And in some instances, you hear actually horror stories, about students having to pay like 4 months in advance of rent to secure a place. And when they're coming to Canada, they're not coming with bags full of money. Most of them are not. So if we can actually help them alleviate some of the stress surrounding these stressors, then it might be easier for them to concentrate on their study. For our domestic student, it's actually study and life balance skills and the amount of coursework, of academic coursework that are the two highest stressors. So it's directly actually related to college life. The one that was really sad for me is that discrimination to this day is still a stressor for our international students. And when we think about this, it's heartbreaking because there's so many, we should be in an inclusive, accepting environment. And despite all the efforts that we are making, we're still not quite there because they're still feeling stress and experiencing discrimination. Okay, so when we looked at overall the portrait of how students react to stress, we can say that international students tended to respond more positively to stress. So they had more positive emotion and things like that to respond to stressors, whereas the domestic student tended to have more negative reaction to stress. And once again, the difference between domestic and international students regarding how they cope and they deal with stress did not find any differences. But I'm hoping that if I ever do this study again, it will highlight, because based on some things that we see in the classroom, there seems to be differences, but I only had half the student population that I needed in order to the discrimination. The study could not actually tease it apart. So it just asked generally about discrimination. And it would be interesting to follow up and try to determine if it's on campus or off campus, because then different strategies to remediate this could be actually implemented. And this study actually paved the ground for the other one that I did, which looked at how students were doing in remote learning environments. So once we actually went online for the majority of the courses, I ran a study looking at how well students were dealing with the demands of remote learning, and looking at differences again between first year or second year students, the programs they were enrolled in. And this time we also measure anxiety and depression to see how it correlates with learning in the online learning environment. So are there any questions?
So Isabel, one of the questions I have is really, you looked at first year students, and we haven't done a deep dive in the similar questions on upper year students, but what would your best guess be about how these stresses and anxieties and these issues progress over the course of an educational career?
I think in some instances it gets better if they get the support, right? So if we can point them in the right direction, like I've followed students through ECE programs, and some of them that struggle in the beginning with certain stressors, if they got the support at school and through the services offered at Georgian, it got better. But in other instances, when nothing was done, or because sometimes they don't always share that they need help or acknowledge that they need support, it just got worse. Like there's some students that move like 5 times in a year, and all because of finances and things happening with their landlord. And that's a huge cause of stress just for them, because imagine, being an international student, some of them don't even have driver licenses, and having to move. Like some of them were telling me they walked from the store with their mattresses to where they were living. And I'm thinking, like, why is this still possible? Why isn't there anything that we can do to support these students better? It would be interesting to see over longer periods of time, because I know since this study was ran in 2019, there's a lot of new initiatives that were put forth at Georgian. So it would be interesting if we redid this study like in 2021 to see if it would change between the two cohorts if things are better for first year students when they come.
Yeah, it's almost like we're in a different world now than
Yeah.
2019, isn't it?
Yes. But I think some of these issues are the same, because I think 2 weeks ago I had a student, she's like, I'm coming to Canada soon. And she's like, I'm going to be going to the Orangeville campus. Can I live in Markham? And I'm like, okay, let's look at the geography here. I'm like, do you have a car? She's like, no. And I was like, well, probably not, right? It's not. So still some issues I think will keep on being the same.
Yeah.
But like in Aurelia, I've seen some changes to better support students with transportation, for example, since the study was first done. So I would think that hopefully the same is true of other campuses too. Because here I should say it's not just Aurelia students. So we recruited across all campuses because it was posted on the student portal. Yes, it's true. Yes, that each campus does not have a representation from the International Center. And it's true that we have amazing faculty, right, at Georgian that will try their best. But often, I think one of the problems is students don't necessarily talk or share, right, that they experience these stressors. And it's not until you start kind of asking probing questions that you realize, okay, well, this is something that, you know, we can support. And I know, for example, in Aurelia, when we learned about discrimination and them feeling like they were missing home, in ECE, we actually had a gathering when we still could, and we had meals from all the different countries, and they got to tell us about, you know, where they were from and some of the things they experienced here and what are some of the things they were missing from home, so we could try to actually make a connection for them so they felt less isolated.
So Isabel, my question for you is, if you were to continue this research, where would you want to go next?
I think I would go back to the drawing board in a sense, because this project, I had bigger hopes for it, and then COVID kind of threw a curveball at me. And what I would do is try to actually convince GC Rep to let me also measure anxiety and depression, because there's a correlation as well between coping mechanism and anxiety and depression. I couldn't do it for this study, it was too long, but I would like to do it, but include all students. So I started with first year students to get a starting point, but I would do it now with across the board, all students. And I would also measure one thing. Well, I didn't have to do it this time because it was first year students, but I would measure what year they're in, because we do find differences between first semester, second semester students, third and fourth semester students. And even with the anxiety and the stress, sometimes it actually goes up in terms of the semesters they're in, and looking at differences between different programs as well. So I would capture, I think, more socio-demographic variable, but then that would mean I need a much bigger sample size. So I would have to go probably from like 400 to much, much, much bigger.
And let's hope that another pandemic doesn't interfere with your data collection.
No, just don't want to go back to the remote learning environment.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Or comments, reactions? If not, then Isabel, thank you so much for sharing with that. It's been a really interesting for me to see the difference, just like looking at not just first year students and not students as a whole, but really teasing out between the international and the domestic students, because I think there are unique circumstances and unique stressors, as we're clearly seeing. And I look forward to seeing where the research goes and where this goes for our Georgian students. And I think it's relevant for students in all post-secondary, really.
Yes, and it's been shared like with different departments that have asked me. So There's a lot of data too. So if there's any of you that would like to see something specific, then I can look at the data more specifically by program, because I did actually collect that data for that one.
And as we can see in the chat, there is some interest around program specific stressors and appetite to see more of the study.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Just send me an email and I'd be happy to share with you the data, or even looking at the study itself, how it was done online.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you for everyone for joining.